So the final workshop dealt with the issue of relations with the plantation industry and covered obligations and impediments for the plantation industry in relation to orangutan conservation. And the conclusions of the group are going to be presented to you by Helen Buckland, who is the UK director of the Sumatran Orangutan Society. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'll just give you a bit of context about this issue and how it relates to the wider issue we're discussing this evening. The conversion of orangutan habitat and high conservation value forests more generally to oil palm plantations is now considered by conservation scientists as the primary threat to the continued existence of the orangutan in the wild. And it's also, therefore, a primary source of the orangutans that are currently found in rescue and rehabilitation centres. We've got a map up on the screen here. This basically shows a bit of the interaction between orangutan habitat and oil palm plantations. This is Kalimantan, so Indonesian Borneo. The black areas are current orangutan habitat, orange areas are oil palm plantations, and the red areas is where oil palm is overlapping with orangutan habitat. There's a huge global demand for palm oil, and this is set to continue to grow, and it's very unlikely that this is going to stop. In order to meet this demand, we need to do various things to meet this demand without damaging forests any further, including increasing yields on existing plantations and also redirecting plantations away from high conservation value areas and onto degraded lands, of which there's over 18 million hectares within Indonesia alone. There is a means to address this through an initiative called the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, the RSPO, which is a multi-stakeholder certification body which does include principles addressing biodiversity and the identification of high conservation values in the landscape. So we talked about obligations of the palm oil industry, impediments to their meeting these obligations, where the responsibility lies for conservation in Indonesia and Malaysia, and some suggested solutions. So the obligations of the palm oil companies are several. Firstly, they have commercial obligations to their stakeholders. They need to make a lot of money. They have legal obligations, which include things like maintaining water quality and also species protection. They have corporate social responsibility obligations, including to their employees, the wider community, and the environment. Then, under the terms of their lease on the palm oil concessions, they have to actually utilise the full extent of the concession land that they've been granted by the government. So, some impediments to the effective use of conservation within an agricultural landscape include blatant conflict between many of these obligations at the plantation level, weakness of enforcement regarding species protection and protected area boundaries, especially in Indonesia, a lack of capacity in conducting social and environmental audits, environmental impact assessments, high conservation value land assessments. And primary impediment is the fact that high conservation value land is not identified and integrated into national level land use plans. So the government is handing out concessions to oil palm and other plantation industries in high conservation value lands, including orangutan habitat. At the moment, only members of the Roundtable of Sustainable Palm Oil have an obligation to consider high conservation values when they are developing an area of land, and they represent only around 35% of global production of palm oil. So, as I said, the responsibility basically lands with the government, not at the plantation level. They are the ones handing out the concessions. However, the responsibility is ultimately falling to NGOs, groups working on the ground, to take the responsibility to identify the high conservation value areas and to take on the burden of rescuing animals from areas that are being converted to plantations. Some of the solutions that we have suggested is that high conservation value areas need to be defined at a variety of levels, including at the landscape level and even at the island level for Borneo and Sumatra, rather than at the moment as they are at the plantation level. And these need to be integrated into national land use plans. The RSPO should use their leverage to encourage this with the government of Indonesia and Malaysia, as the high conservation value concept is a central principle to the RSPO and their environmental commitments. Plantations also need to help with identifying areas of value within their concessions and help with establishing management plans to manage high conservation values, including things like orangutans and other biodiversity and social commitments to local communities as well. So some conclusions. Next slide. Obviously, the top priority, just to repeat again, is to integrate the identification and protection of high conservation value land in national land use planning so that we don't have these conflicts between areas of oil palm plantations and orangutan habitat. There should be no overlap. We need to produce a definitive set of maps identifying no-go zones for development, which would be of enormous value to all stakeholders in this argument. We need to build the capacity of independent conservation practitioners and auditors to identify high conservation values and conduct these assessments at a landscape level. We need to collaborate with the industry by facilitating companies to meet their commitments to preserve orangutan habitats, so strengthening the current RSPO, which has a lot of holes in it currently, but is nevertheless an important initiative. We need to build public support in Indonesia and Malaysia for conservation and make this an important issue to everybody on the ground. So coming back to the motion, we as a group recognise the necessity of continuing rehabilitation work, but we believe the bulk of resources should be directed to habitat conservation. This is because this would stop the flow of orangutans coming into rescue and rehabilitation centres and would also provide secure habitat for those animals that are currently in the centres to be released into.